So just a little bit about me. I am actually one of your university neighbours. I'm studying at Birkbeck at the moment. I'm doing a master's in culture, diaspora and ethnicity. So looking at some of the things I'll be discussing today, particularly around critical race theory. And before that, I used to work in education. I was a teacher for 10 years and have studied Christian apologetics, so looking at some of these difficult questions about the faith and seeing how, if at all, how we can reconcile our faith with that. So that's just a bit about me. And I'm going to share my screen because I've got a few quotes. It might be easier for us to see what it is I'm saying if I share my screen. So let me just find it, sorry. Here we go. Can you see that? Okay, great. Let me just run it. So yeah, we're looking at this tricky question, which is how can I reconcile my faith with cultural identity? And this whole week of events is around looking at what it means to be a Christian at the intersections of faith, culture, and history. So if you want to follow me at all or want to see what it is I'm doing, just please do go ahead. But I find it interesting about how this question is phrased because it suggests that Christianity on the one hand and culture are in this sort of conflict, and that any attempt to bring them together may result in some loss, and often the loss of one's cultural identity. Now, it was in June this year that the social activist Sean King, he wrote a controversial tweet calling for statues of white Jesus to be pulled down. And I'm paraphrasing what he said, but he was saying these statues of white Jesus need to be pulled down because they represent white supremacy and oppression. Now, Sean King, a former Christian pastor, identified how the widespread depictions alone of Jesus as a white man carried with them this oppressive ideology, an ideology that reads blackness out of the Christian narrative. And for King, it's like this cruel irony that paintings of white Jesus actually erased ethnic minority cultures. And I remember actually as a child going to family members' house, my black family members' house, and seeing Christian imagery, so praying hands, white praying hands in picture frames, or seeing pictures of the Lord's Supper of the disciples with Jesus, and seeing a very white looking, European looking set of disciples and Jesus in the homes of my black family and black church members. And we know that sadly the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery sparked global protests about the dignity of black lives. Conversations on TV, on podcasts, on social media, they all erupted about racism. Racism which is still very much alive in 2020. And one particular conversation which is relevant to this question we're looking at today is a conversation hosted by Justin Brierley on Premier Radio and also on their YouTube channel, the unbelievable discussions that he hosts between Christians and non-Christians. Now, on this particular panel, a group of people were discussing whether the UK church is racist. And a woman called Chiney MacDonald, she's Nigerian born, she made several thought-provoking contributions, and she recalled a time when she and her white husband went to Nigeria for a family event. And whilst over there, Chiney and her husband went to a church service to celebrate the birth of their son. And this is what she says. She says, we went to a Methodist church. We danced in with about 50 relatives, a goat, chicken, yams, everything. My husband is white, and we got to the front of the church, and the minister said that it was a particularly blessed day because they had a white man in their presence. I found it fascinating that in the country where I'm from, in a rural village in Nigeria, that it was my husband who was seen as the special one. There's a lot of reasons why that would be so, looking at colonial narratives. So Chiney also mentions that the minister celebrated the fact that a biracial child, her son, was being baptized. And to some, this may sound like a rather innocuous story, but it actually portrays a toxic form of Christianity, which privileges whiteness over blackness. It portrays the legacy of colonialism lingering on in both the black and white theological imagination. So with the example of Sean King's condemnation of white Jesus and my own recollections of white Christian imagery in black church members' homes, and now with Chinwe MacDonald's unsettling story of her white husband being celebrated in a Nigerian church precisely because he's white, well, today's question is indeed a legitimate one, especially if you're an ethnic minority listening to this. How do I reconcile my faith with cultural identity? These examples that I've already given show how ethnic minority culture seems to have been distorted because of Christianity. How do I reconcile my faith with cultural identity? So to grapple with this question, let's consider two further questions. So the first one being, what insights or help can we get about navigating cultural identity from critical race theory? And two, what is significant about Jesus's cultural identity? Okay, so to question number one, what insights or help can we get about navigating cultural identity from critical race theory? So as students at SOAS, and I'm as I said, your neighbour student at Birkbeck, critical theory underpins quite a lot of what we do and our approach to research. I'm in the psychosocial department, so critical race theory is just the way that we do, the methods that we use. But as I'm sure you will have seen, critical race theory has been under a lot of scrutiny, especially as ideas and phrases that kind of began in the academy have trickled down to the popular level in everyday speech. Phrases like white privilege, oppressed and oppressor, white guilt or fragility, systemic or institutional racism, and of course, social justice. Now, these words are triggering for some people. They are liberating for other people. And they also are met with indifference by other people too. So arguably the most influential institution is Parliament. And recently the Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, I think that's how you pronounce her surname, well, she made this statement about critical race theory. She said, "What we are against is the teaching of contested ideas as if they are accepted fact. We don't do this with communism. We don't do this with socialism. We don't do this with capitalism." And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home in my life. And it's the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I want to be absolutely clear. This government stands unequivocally against critical race theory. Black Lives Matter, of course they do. And so she goes on to talk about, to show her position. Now, on seeing this, I can understand that as from my experience as a teacher, as I said, I taught in secondary schools for 10 years, there is a certain amount of professionalism that needs to come about by having a neutral position. You can't teach your own personal perspective or your own personal beliefs. You have to teach the curriculum. And so I understand her point there. But as she said, she's clear in her personal and then Parliament's stand against critical race theory. And she says that she's wary of the seeming victim oppressed / oppressor paradigm that is inherent within critical race theory. And so she rejects it. But then perhaps a critical race theorist would argue that Badenoch's rallying of the government against critical race theory is precisely the type of institutional oppression which disadvantages ethnic minorities by ignoring or interpreting their cries of justice as victimhood. And as we're discussing for today's question, interpreting the crushing of ethnic minority cultural identity by majority culture, interpreting that as victimhood. And I'm sure you'll agree that victimhood has a very different tone and is more pejorative than the phrase oppressed. So she chooses to use the word victimhood rather than oppressed. And that's interesting because in his seminal essay, which is provocatively titled, Who's Afraid of Critical Theory, Derek Bell, he's one of the pioneers of the discipline, he writes this: from the perspective of critical race theory, some positions have historically been oppressed, distorted, ignored, silenced, destroyed, appropriated, commodified, and marginalized, and all of this not accidentally. It's interesting that Derek Bell does not use the term victimhood or victimized. And Derek Bell goes on to quote someone else in this essay. He quotes quite a few people, but he quotes Angela Harris, and she articulates the aims of critical race theory, very interesting in the light of Christianity, which we'll get onto shortly. She says that CRT's ultimate vision is redemptive, not deconstructive. And so I'm inferring that Harris, that Bell, and other critical race theorists, their aim is to redeem the cultures or identities of oppressed peoples. And of course, that's a laudable aim. We can praise them for that. But I do see a certain limitation or slight incoherence with this aim, because if people fall into oppressed and oppressor groups by default and seem to remain there because of their race, they seem to remain there in perpetuity, can they ever be redeemed? But the fact is, Derek Bell and Kemi Badenoch, they have completely different views. But for me, whilst the equalities minister, she has a very cautious, even suspect approach to critical race theory, we must be clear about something. Well, critical race theory did not create racial injustices we see in society today. It's actually quite a helpful theoretical lens, or even magnifying glass, which highlights the reality of racial injustice. Critical race theory is not responsible for disparities in the outcomes of Afro-Caribbean boys in secondary school, something that's really close to my heart as a former teacher. Critical race theory is not responsible for the finding that shows that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. Critical race theory is not responsible for the persistent and disproportionate stop and search, arrests and charges of ethnic minorities. Critical race theory didn't create that, but it helps us to see that. And so with all this in mind about critical race theory, some of its strengths, and as I said, some of its limitations, what are we supposed to do then? How are we supposed to try and find hope, comfort or peace in Christianity when these harsh realities, these examples of racial injustice at systemic or institutional levels exist? How can we find comfort in Christianity if a white Jesus is looking back at us and seeming to require us to give up our cultural identity? Is Christianity just another oppressive institution stripping away our cultural identity? So that brings us to our second question. What is significant then about Jesus's cultural identity? This may sound like a bit of an ironic question, because with so many depictions of white Jesus in Western culture, it can be very easy to assume that these artistic impressions of Jesus are historically accurate, that Jesus was indeed a blonde-haired, a blue-eyed man. But it always amazes me that for someone claiming to be God incarnate, Jesus had such humble beginnings and a shameful seeming end. His parents were refugees. His family was poor, and we know that from the gospel accounts, which talk about the type of sacrifice that they could bring into the synagogue. So we know the family was poor. He belonged to an historically persecuted ethnic minority group, the Jewish community. Jesus grew up in the underwhelming town of Nazareth. He shared and taught his message through the use of parables, and that gives us evidence that Jesus was an authentic member of first century Jewish rabbinic culture. Jesus was ostracized for speaking truth to power. He was falsely accused. Jesus was criminalized, and he endured an illegal trial. He was executed in a most horrific and shameful way. And why am I saying all of this? Well, Jesus was steeped in cultural identity. He speaks profoundly to the experience of many ethnic minorities who often face injustice, just like this, just like Jesus did. But the Christian claim goes further than that, okay? The Christian claim is of a God incarnate, a God who became human, stepped into humanity, not only to the cultural identity of oppressed Jews in first century Palestine, but he took on the cultural identity of humanity. So according to the Bible in Philippians chapter 2, verses 7 to 8, in spite of his divinity, Jesus made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And I find this really intriguing because the Christian claim is that Jesus's death and his resurrection are for the purposes of redemption. And this is a very similar aim to what critical race theorists are trying to do. But the Christian claim is different because Jesus's death and resurrection deals with the human heart that creates oppressive systems. So the conversation goes two ways. Some people will say that critical race theory is limited because it just looks at systems and institutions, but it doesn't look at the people, it doesn't take on board interpersonal racism. How can a system be racist? And then critical race theorists point the other way and say, no, critical race theorists will say, no, the systems in themselves are racist. But what the Christian faith is saying, both positions are true. It's the human heart. It's the human heart that creates these systems. And the Christian claim is that Jesus came to redeem the human heart. So this is why, interestingly, in the biblical accounts, we see a cross-section, such a range of ethnic groups becoming Christians. We learn of a Samaritan woman. Brandon talked about this in his talk. A Samaritan woman and her community becoming Christians. A Nubian official, some translations have it as an Ethiopian official becoming a Christian. We learn about Greek philosophers becoming Christians and many, many others. And what I'm encouraged by in the Bible is that in each of these accounts, we don't see the Bible erasing or silencing cultural identity. No, what we see is cultural identity and ethnic identity being celebrated. And the newfound faith of these cultural others, they live it out in their own cultures. In the story of the Samaritan woman in St. John chapter 4, she decides to become a Christian and she tells other people. Tells other Samaritans. They then come to listen to Jesus for themselves, and then they decide to be Christians. But what we get in that description, they are never not called the Samaritans. When they decide to become Christians, they are still called the Samaritans. Their ethnic culture, their cultural identity remains. Becoming a Christian should not erase that. And so this is not just the case with the past accounts or biblical accounts of cultural diversity in the Bible. In her book called Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, Dr. Rebecca McClaughlin, she writes, Christianity is the most ethnically, culturally, socioeconomically, and racially diverse belief system in all of history. Now, I definitely recommend you get this book. As it says there, she looks through 12 difficult questions and explains them really clearly. But her point here is that Christianity is adhered to by many different people. Dr. Vince Bantu, and I'm sure you've already heard from him this week, he's a fantastic theologian. In his book, he talks about this: Christianity is not becoming a global religion, it has always been a global religion. And this book is from 2020, so hot off the press, A Multitude of All Peoples. And in this book, he's dismantling misleading Eurocentric narratives about Christianity. Definitely one to get hold of as well. And so our question, what is significant about Jesus's cultural identity? How does it help us with, reconciling my faith with cultural identity? Well, because of the incarnation, the Christian claim that God became human, we have a good precedent for living, for breathing, and being Christians in our own cultural skin. Becoming a Christian is not a loss of one's culture, but becoming more of oneself, becoming more of yourself in relationship with God. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Claire. We do have one question, but if anyone has any more questions, please put that on the Slido. We'll take some of Brandon's questions in like the final question round, which is after Itari speaks. So one question is, could you explain what critical race theory is?
That's a good question. So critical race theory is like a theoretical framework for trying to address some of the injustices we see in society. I've actually got the essay up by Derek Bell, and I'm going to read you a quote from it because he explains it better than I can. 1 second, sorry. So critical race theory is, I'll say the quote that I said before, it's a way of trying to highlight that certain groups of people have historically been oppressed, distorted, ignored, silenced, destroyed, appropriated, commodified, and marginalized. And not just historically, but that continues today. So it's a way of looking at these injustices. Now, I do think, as I said, it has its limitations for different reasons, but it's more of a framework for looking through. And then people like, for instance, Sean King and other social activists will use that as like a foundation to do social activism. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. I have a question of my own. I didn't know about the pulling down statues of white Jesus. I guess, yes, last 2 days we had like a similar question specifically on like the Black Lives Matter protest. But I guess as Christians, in terms of activism and in terms of standing up for justice, specifically to do with, let's say, images of white Jesus, is there a need for us to take such action, and would it be helpful, or would you suggest something else?
Great question. I think that what Sean King was getting at in that tweet, which I think has been missed by a lot of some Christian responses I saw to his tweet, was, and obviously Twitter is 140 characters, however many characters, you can only say so much, and very controversial statement. What Sean King was getting at was the ideology and the historical baggage that comes with these very pervasive images of white Jesus. And so whilst it may have sounded, and I don't know, that he was saying, go out there and violently pull statues down, and some people did or have pulled other statues down, the main thrust of what he was saying was the ideology that comes with it. And I think from the examples I've given, it's still it's going on right now, that the legacy of colonialism is still at work in Christianity. And so this question about white Jesus and is Christianity the white man's religion, your whole theme, it's not a new question. I remember growing up and hearing my dad talk to Black men, because my dad was a pastor, and coaching them, talking to them, and they were asking, Christianity is the white man's religion, and really upset because not only do you have the historical legacy of racism, you have the present day racial injustices that we face. And that was back then in the 90s, okay? and they turn to Rastafarianism because of that. This is not a new question. All things like Sean King's tweet, the global protest, they have thrown this question, propelled it into the public sphere. And so I think that as Christians, I don't think, as Brandon was saying in his talk, that we should condone like violent tearing down or destruction of buildings. I don't think that's what we should do. But in our, because I go to a Black majority church, if there is going to be an image of Jesus, what's wrong with that image of Jesus being Black or looking like a Semitic man from first century Palestine? There's nothing wrong with that. But it's the ideological baggage that comes about with it. And so that needs to be talked about, that needs to be disentangled. And that's why Vince Bantu is doing some fantastic work.
Thank you. Suddenly we have a flood of questions. So I'll ask a few, maybe two. This is an interesting question. It says, how do you think the narrative would change if Jesus was historically white?
That's a lot of guesswork there. I don't know if Utara wants to jump in as well. I'm not sure, because so much of the way the world works now has been dependent upon what happened historically. I can only work with what's actually happened. And Jesus wasn't white, but even though Jesus wasn't white, we still have this kind of white ideology about Christianity, which is very, very sad and needs to be dismantled. So I'm not really sure I can answer that. I'm kind of dodging that question. I'm not really sure what to say, but it's a very very unique question. Sorry, I don't really know what to say.
No problem. Okay, one last question. So do you think the protests, looting, destruction that we are seeing of the Black Lives Matter protest is victimhood and white guilt?
I think that again, leaning to this quote that Brandon said in his talk from Martin Luther King's father, protest is the cry of people who go unheard. Now, protest and looting are two very different things. And actually during all of this stuff that was happening with racial injustice, particularly around George Floyd, I couldn't hardly pray. I could only read the book of Psalms. And when you read the whole book of Psalms, protest, complaint before God, lament, crying out, asking God to stand up for you. Protest is within the Psalm. So protest isn't antithetical to Christianity. We are called to stand up against injustice. When people go unheard for a very, very long time, they can resort to more violent and more extreme means, and then sadly I do think that kind of gets played or gets seen more in what we hear in the media or anything like that, rather than the pain that is behind the protest. What happens is protest is then politicized, and I don't think that's helpful. Is it victimhood and white guilt? As I said in my talk, I have a bit of an issue with the term victimhood. I don't think that highlighting oppression is the same thing as victimhood. Victimhood has a very negative connotation, like someone is self-pitying and determined to see themselves as a victim. I think a lot of the time, ethnic minorities and Black people are saying, look, we don't deserve to be treated unequally, and we're making steps and progress to move forward. So the victimhood thing, I'm not sure. White guilt, I'm not really sure how that comes into it, because to my mind, white guilt is the feeling of being complicit or responsible for racism within white people's groups. So I'm not quite sure how that works with the idea of protest, although there were some reports of white people within the protest as well and being part of looting. I guess what I'm trying to say, and I'll bring this to a close, I think protests and looting, I'm very careful about how I speak about it, because I hear some people just say looting and they're burning things and they're pulling down statues. Protests and those things are two very distinct things. And I would ask the question, why are people resorting to that? Am I affirming that? No, but why? Is it because they've not been listened to for such a long time?